Welcome back, honeys. It is time for a brand new episode. Now, I have to admit something. I know what today's episode is called, but surprise, surprise, it's actually just the mostly northern, less famous guys, i.e. not Raphael, Leonardo, or Mike, the ones who didn't exactly follow the typical Italian Renaissance path. That means that today we'll be learning new things about lesser-known things, aka why and how the Northern Renaissance matters, and not just to me. So really, this episode should be called The Other Renaissance Guys, and we'll just pretend that it is, and always has been named that. An incomplete list of today's sources includes Smart History, the Hill Museum and Manuscript Library, the Met, the Art Institute of Chicago, the Museo del Prado, the National Gallery of the UK, the National Gallery of Scotland, and more. There's several important things to understand about the Renaissance, honeys, so let's situate ourselves back in time and think about what the common people, as well as the political entities of the day, are dealing with. When it comes to art at large, this period was marked by the spread of Renaissance culture and ideas from Italy through the rest of the European continent. The Renaissance can be split into different parts. The initial, maybe about 1510s to 1600, the High Renaissance, which was roughly the first 2 decades of the 16th century, and then Mannerism, which overlapped with both, spanning about the 1520s to about 1600. Though it is generally the artists who were creating during the early 1500s, like Leo da Vinci, Michelangelo, Raphael, Durer, El Greco, Titian, who dominate the discussions of 16th century art. Even within these 3 periods, we see different interpretations of new Renaissance values, ideas, etc., between the North and the South. The Met notes that the Italian Renaissance is known best for its advancements in color, the understanding of anatomy gained during this time, a renewed interest in secular, aka non-religious, subject matter. The Northern Renaissance, they say, though, is celebrated for realistic altarpieces and portraits, what they call exquisite brushwork, and the popularization of prints. There were some parallels, however, between the 2 Renaissances. Because people across Europe began thinking less about the next life and more about the one they were in, they became more concerned with the beauties of earth. Philosophy as well as art showed a more intense focus on representing earthly environments, the forms of actual people, despite a continued strength of faith demonstrated by continued Old and New Testament theme usage. This means that not only did faces and figures become more individualized, but artists began to shift from showing the range of human emotion in terms of biblical stories to exploring it more widely in terms of classical stories as well as contemporary portraits. This recentering of art, basically, on the representational became the modern European expression format. The Met says, quote, "The achievements of 14th and 15th century Italy shaped all subsequent art well into the 19th century," end quote. As we will see, this may be in part due to how many Northern artists traveled to Italy at some point in their lives. Some would go on to adapt elements of the Italian Renaissance, for example, classical architecture forms, and go on to create new hybrid painting styles that spread throughout Europe. Honeys, you may be asking yourself, why was there a regional split in the first place? And of course, it's because context. So let's zoom out from the art to look at the bigger picture of the 16th century. We had some general history-changing advancements, including the invention of the printing press. One huge impact of that invention is that it led to the translation of the Bible from original languages into local vernaculars and common languages, for example, German and French. Not only did this legitimize such languages, it also allowed the Bible to become a little more accessible if you knew how to read. This was also the advent of mechanically reproducible media such as woodcuts and engravings. The printing press especially affected the accessibility of art in the North in that way. It allowed images to be mass-produced and therefore widely available to the public. But the North and the South of Europe saw slightly different developmental paths. So let's start with Italy, our more familiar part in this compare and contrast. The first thing to remember about Italy is that the single modern nation state we know it as today, also Italians as a group identifier, didn't even exist until the late 19th century. Instead, the regions were considered super closely linked by proximity, elements of culture, economies and trade habits, a shared Roman history, but the people called themselves Florentines, Venetians, Romans, Genoese, for example. When it comes to politics, it's crucial to remember that this is the time of Machiavelli's The Prince, and also, important reminder on Machiavelli's The Prince, his original quote was, "Better to be feared than loved, if you can't be both." He never advocated for leaders straight up making their people scared en masse. As we know, this is a time of major scientific and social development as well as discovery from what we now know as Italy. The culture showed renewed interests in the natural world and anatomical study as well as astronomy and other fields. And a bit on Italy's specific art context. Because materials, studio spaces, and assistants were expensive, these aesthetic objects always had a specific function in the Renaissance world. Their secondary concern was being pretty. When it comes to patrons and investors, that was the governing class of merchants and bankers. The social and economic elite were patrons of art and architecture as part of their civic duties, as a show of their faith, as demonstrations of their virtue, and also, of course, as a way to show off their wealth and their sense of fine tastes. What's unique about the Italian context is that art was not split by genre along lines of specific location. So religious art was just about everywhere you looked. Statues and markets, various decorations around town, even in tapestries. As Smart History puts it, quote, public imagery shared space with Christian subjects, sometimes in such close proximity that the symbolic relationship between the church and state was explicit, such with Donatello's monument to the mercenary captain Erasmo da Narni, placed conspicuously in front of Padua's cathedral, end quote. In this region, in the 1500s, contemplating works of art was an important pastime, so it was often shown in the home as a conversation starter for meaningful, deep conversations, a celebration of familial ties or friendships or even military achievements, or else a show of faithfulness. Now, when it comes to the Spanish context, I hope you can remember a little bit from Las Meninas because we were just in the 15 and 1600s in that episode. But here's a little recap for you. We're talking about the so-called Golden Age of Spain here. This was an era of political consolidation for them due to the rise of the Habsburg dynasty, meaning we saw widespread social, religious, and intellectual changes throughout the 16th century. Our sources remind us that this was a very global time for the nation. They benefited not only from European inventions such as the printing press and the spread of various ideas as well as literature, they also engaged in taxonomical studies of living things, new understandings of anatomy, and of course the Inquisition to ensure Spain's Catholic identity. In the 16th century, renowned authors increased the prestige of Spanish as a literary language by utilizing these new Renaissance genres, innovations like sonnets, for example, as well as revitalizing traditional Spanish genres like the Romance, a traditional poetic form. Such authors were Miguel de Cervantes, the famous Quixote author, Felix Lope de Vega, Pedro Calderón de la Barca, Francisco Quevedo, Luis de Góngora, and others. Spain also played a big part in this series of inter-influences. Say our sources, quote, artists from around Europe traveled to the Iberian Peninsula to look for favor with the Spanish court, and artworks flowing in from other parts of the empire influenced artists already working in Spain, end quote. And shifting to the north, let's talk about what was going on there to talk about why their art looks so different. First things first, the northern states played a much bigger role and saw much more development than you may remember when it comes to the Renaissance. The region saw the rise of capitalism, the beginning of a strong middle class, the creation of modern nation-states such as Germany, the Netherlands, and sociopolitical shifts, especially due to the Protestant Reformation. And we can't emphasize the importance of these Reformation-based shifts enough. It affected the production of art. It inspired artists to develop new genres of artwork that depicted elements of daily life because they rejected certain types of religious images, i.e., Reformation supporting ones. The Reformation shifted artistic patronage towards the rising merchant class from the traditional center around the church and aristocracy, especially with the growth of urban centers and robust art markets within them. Artists in the northern region are also responsible for one of art history's biggest game changers, perfection of oil paints. They managed to nail this down in about the 1420s in the Netherlands, which at that point were often called the Low Countries, and this allowed these northern painters to depict the world with an unprecedented precision and sense of internal illumination, meaning light seems to believably come from within the painting. Northern Renaissance artists are also behind several new at the time categories of painting, including the landscape, the portrait, the animal and still life works, as well as scenes of everyday life known as genre painting. In fact, some of the most active centers of painting, rivaling even later overtaking the feted Italian masters and their cities, were located within present-day Holland, Belgium, and Luxembourg. Artists received commissions for tapestries, illuminated books, paintings, etc. by patrons such as the ruling House of Burgundy, religious orders, private citizens of the wealthy towns of Ghent, Bruges, Brussels, and Tournai, and more across the 16th century. And now, honeys, that we have covered the context, here they are, the other guys. Starting with who the National Gallery of Art says is the best known and arguably the greatest German artist of all time, Albrecht Dürer. A very short biography for Dürer. He was born in Nuremberg in 1471. He was one out of 18 kids, though only 3 made it to adulthood. His father was a talented goldsmith who taught him the basics of drawing and metalworking, including engraving skills. Dürer was apprenticed from 1486 to 1489 to Nuremberg's leading painter, a Michael Wohlgemuth, who was a prolific designer of woodcut prints. Dürer was one of our big travelers. He toured the great art centers of Germany and the Netherlands for 4 years after that apprenticeship and took several trips to Italy across his life. These introduced him to theories of perspective and proportion, considered important beyond words for the history of Northern European art. Dürer began combining the structure and corporeality of Italian art with the extensive detail and emotional narratives common to Northern art as a result of these trips, mostly through studying the works of Antonio Pollaiuolo, Andrea Mantegna, Giovanni Bellini, and others. This contact with the Italian artists deepened his fascinations with art theory so much, he began intensive studies leading to a publication of detailed treatises on human proportion, applied geometry, and military fortification in 1505. Dürer died on April 6th of 1528, the National Gallery says possibly as a result of a malarial infection contracted in 1521, though that's not 100% certain. So why does Dürer matter? He was and still is an engraver without peer before the age of 30. His studies of nature, human anatomy, proportion, and perspective laid the foundation for these engravings as well. So we see how the immaterial ideas of the Renaissance became tangible things through their effects on art. Dürer's patrons were incredibly notable, reaching the heights of society themselves, including even the Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian I, who paid Dürer's annual pension, though he wasn't exclusively a court painter. Dürer was exceptionally entrepreneur-minded. He continued to paint, yet he realized that the printing press was a much more reliable source of income and made that switch. He even had an immediate impact on the artists of his day, says the Museo Thyssen. Quote, some of the most important 16th century German painters trained in his studio, including Hans Suess von Kolmach, Hans Baldung Grien, Wolf Traut, Hans Leonard Schauffelein, and Hans Springelke. How many Hans can we possibly have? Jesus. But of course, his legacy is best told through his artwork, so let's talk about some of the most famous ones. First, The Apocalypse from 1497 through 98. This work shows some of the anxieties around the rumored potential end of the world with the end of the 16th century, especially with these quote-unquote omens everywhere at the time. The northern region did see at the end of the 1500s a higher than usual amount of floods, comets, and eclipses. It also makes reference to the sort of Gothic medieval look and sense of Nuremberg, where it seems to be occurring. The Art Institute of Chicago notes that this is one of his most ambitious woodcuts in terms of size, graphic complexity, as well as variety and novelty of the subjects depicted. Christie's Auction House notes that it seems to be derived from the revelation of St. John and adds to this gloomy social mood. We can also take a look at Adam and Eve of 1504, often called his self-conscious masterpiece. Only a few years before its creation, in 1489, a Hellenistic sculpture of Apollo Belvedere was unearthed near Rome, and this became the model for the Adam figure we see here. So Dürer is responding not only to his own day and the events of it, but also to the Old Testament biblical scenes a little bit. The piece is largely celebrated for the unprecedented level of detail and even the sense of softness that Dürer is able to achieve in his engraving here in the human skin and the tree bark, the lines of those. Dürer more than earned his place in the art historical canon with these really impressive engravings that utilize the technology as well as the lessons and styles of his time. Now, according to the Met, there's one specific place we can see a lot of this Italian influence. That is in his altarpiece, The Feast of the Rose Garlands from 1506. It was commissioned from Dürer by a German colony of merchants living in Venice, and this may be why the Venetian coloring and design patterns stand out. In this work, Dürer shows a new interest in the human form, the nude and antique studies, and Italian theoretical pursuits that were not true of his past works. Dürer was an odd man out when it came to the Northern Renaissance because of these unusual focuses on blending the Italian with the Northern and also on woodcut engravings. Yet even Dürer's self-portraits, take the one from 1500 for example, are very famous for existing and thus normalizing artists' self-portraits when that really was not a thing yet. Though his self-portraits as a collection show his growing confidence and mastery across time, let's focus on the 1500 one for a minute as one of the earlier and thus more controversial renditions. What was considered so scandalous about this painting when it debuted is the fact that it's a full frontal depiction with one of Albrecht's hands raised and the fingers slightly curved. We may think nothing of this positioning today, but at the time, this frontal configuration with that hand pose was exclusively reserved previously for depictions of Jesus Christ. Dürer therefore makes associations with himself as a creator through this creation with status and/or holiness. Yet Dürer still shows a sense of humanism in that he shows himself as a man. We don't see any halo or other overt religious symbols surrounding him. Dürer visually ties himself to the intellectualism prized in the North in the 1500s. By emphasizing his eyes and his hand, Dürer is alluding to reading and writing and thus connecting himself with the sort of intellectualism that was prized in the North at this time. He also speaks to his northernness by capturing the fine details and imperfections of his own face. The Italian artists, however, were known to make themselves a little nicer looking. Next up, we have Hieronymus Bosch. Says the National Art Gallery of this guy, he is, quote, known for creating restlessly imaginative works rich in religious symbolism, allegory, and fantastical elements depicted in bustling scenes across expansive compositions, end quote. Born Hieronymus van Aken, the year of his birth is generally thought to be around 1450, and he was the fourth kid of 5. The Prado Museum, out in Madrid, notes he came from a family of painters spanning 6 generations. The year of his marriage to Aleid van der Merwede is thought to be June of 1481. Bosch enjoyed some level of success. He was able to hire an assistant even during his lifetime. His date of death is believed to be in summer of 1516 when his town was struck by an epidemic, maybe cholera. The town records of church mass ceremonies seem to indicate that Bosch was among the victims that year. Now, Bosch only has about 20 paintings definitively attributed to him, so the question of why he matters is honestly a good one here. But our answer is this. Although most Netherlandish artists showed great respect for tradition, Hieronymus Bosch was extraordinarily, let's say, independent. And on to Bosch's works and legacy / why he is one of our other guys. His earliest known works depicted explicitly religious scenes, but Bosch's iconic style revealed itself over time in paintings of saints especially. Our prime example artwork is Crucifixion with Saints and Donor from about 1485 to 90. This work is considered by experts as something of an outlier in a body of work that favors more eccentric, disconcerting, busy compositions. Such busy and disconcerting compositions is really what Bosch is known best for, though. Take the triptych of the Adoration of the Magi from circa 1494. This painting is widely considered a masterpiece because of the combination it holds: the sprawling, incredible Bethlehem scene, its central action, and then the background's two armies about to collide. This combination of a peaceful foreground and ominous background give viewers a sense of a short-lived peace before a nightmarish scene of religious war to come. The Met underscores the characteristics of Bosch's scene here, such as a tunneling perspective and sensitively rendered faces. Everything draws us into this middle, this question of when is that action going to arrive in our foregrounded space. In spite of this compelling action, Bosch has a way of taking us back out of it as well through other notable elements. These include a stage-like curtain held aloft by angels, so we may actually be seeing a reference to religious plays performed in Bosch's hometown. Let me try my best here. This one's really weird. It's apostrophe S, so I'm going to say S, and then Hertogenbosch. So Hertogenbosch, I guess. Aside from this potential hometown reference, we also have his most famous painting, The Garden of Earthly Delights. The triptych is dated to between 1503 and 1515. It was made to commemorate Count Henry II of Nassau-Breda's wedding. What's incredible about this piece is that it aims to illustrate the benefits as well as the hazards of a marriage through this three-part lens of biblical storytelling. The leftmost panel, a landscape, shows Adam and Eve in harmony together, while a hedonistic paradise occupies the center panel and a blazing hell awaiting any future sinners takes up the right one. In spite of the clear and progressive warning about sinning made through the three panels, Bosch still manages to make a bit of his sense of humor and absurdity shine through. He accomplishes this through putting any human figures in acrobatic poses and creating almost voyeuristic birds and animals. He took a very serious theme in a very serious commission and made it playful enough to speak to his artistic persona more so than the trends and norms of the day. That's why Bosch is one of our other guys. He additionally inspired other Northern Renaissance artists to incorporate their own fantasies as well as Bosch's into their works, especially as reflections of their own political unrest or religious troubles. One such artist just so happens to be the next on our list, Peter Bruegel the Elder. Now, who is Peter Bruegel the Elder and why does he matter? According to the Met, he was the greatest member of a large and important Southern Netherlandish family of artists that were active for 4 generations across the 16th and 17th centuries. A short bio for Bruegel. He lived about 1525 to 1569 and was a longtime resident of Antwerp, the center of publishing in the Netherlands and also a vibrant commercial capital. Within this context, Bruegel was extremely exposed to humanism and so brought this individualizing spirit to traditional subjects. He also was inspired to create brand new ones. Bruegel the Elder became a master in the Painters Guild of St. Luke between 1551 and 1552, then also set off for Italy. As a traveler, he hit up Rome and Naples, passing through the Alps, and then returned to Antwerp sometime in 1554. The next year, Bruegel began to provide the Antwerp artist and publisher Hieronymus Koch with designs for prints. Koch's Antwerp publishing house, At the Four Winds, produced various subject prints, so between 1555 and 63, Bruegel made over 40 Bosch-like engravings for this publishing house. At one point, he copied Bosch's Big Fish Eat Little Fish so well that this copy was attributed to Bosch himself. There's no way to say this that doesn't sound dirty, so I'm just gonna say it. Bruegel the Elder's friendship and close association with Koch continued until Bruegel's death, though he did relocate to Brussels sometime within the last few years of his life. Bruegel the Elder's 2 sons, Peter Bruegel the Younger and Jan Bruegel the Elder, also became artists. Now, why does Bruegel the Elder show up in our other guy's radar? partially because he was especially talented at sort of translating these moralizing subjects into more vernacular languages, especially in drawings and paintings. This means basically that he was really good at depicting, for example, Netherlandish proverbs. Also, says the Met, though Bruegel the Elder's designs are based on traditional sources, his drawings and prints are considered innovative and independent, wide-ranging in their subject matter. And here's where we see him break with some of those Renaissance norms, even Northern norms. Funny story, Bruegel focused on the lives of Flemish commoners so often in his paintings, he got the untrue reputation for being of peasant birth himself, earning the nickname Peasant Bruegel. This in spite of the fact that his patrons were scholars, wealthy businessmen, connoisseurs, and he was also on friendly terms with some of the most prominent humanists in the nation at the time. Some of Bruegel's besties included the cartographer Abraham Ortelius and the publisher Christoph Plantin. Bruegel the Elder, like many of his day, did some religious and mythological depictions, for example, his landscape with the fall of Icarus. Created in 1560, this work expands the perspective to make the titular action, the fall, just one part of a broader whole, a vision, a narrative of the natural and cultivated worlds. If there's any religious work of Bruegel the Elder's that I'd like to cover, it's Fight Between Carnival and Lent of 1559. Hyperallergic tells us that it may be the result of surveying the sheer abundance of ships that were coming in at the Scheldt docks, bearing these luxuries from across the European continent in these 1500s. It's possible that the influx of material goods had influenced his ideas about the spiritual consequences of material consumption, of a materialistic life. Bruegel the Elder weighs out these questions in the work by showing all manner of dichotomies existing in tension at this market and daily chaos at the same time. And within the painting, we see the conflicts between joviality and piety, indulgence and censorship, self-restraint. We see temptation and repentance, even winter and spring via the trees that are featured in this work. The carnival is sometimes interpreted as being about the conflict between sensual medieval Catholicism, which had lots of feast days and relics, and the more austere Reformation Protestantism, which was very Puritan and iconoclast heavy. But this is not quite accurate. It actually references an older, more flexible understanding of personal morality from before modernity, from before 16th century theological shifts away from psychological depth and forgiveness for flaws. Our sources tell us that by Bruegel's century, the 7 deadly sins as moral explanations were eclipsed by the absolutism of the Bible's 10 commandments. When it came to sins, things had gotten very black and white, and Bruegel was advocating really in his works for a return to the past, which had a whole lot more consideration of the gray. This may be why Bruegel does not indicate the right or wrongness of either one of these sides of the dichotomies, does not say Carnival or Lent is more correct. Bruegel atypically does not give us a lesson here. He only indicates that both exist, both are in conflict, Carnival and Lent, that is, as well as the other dichotomies I mentioned. By taking this pretty overtly religious subject, Carnival and Lent, and turning it into more of an observance scene than a narrative, Bruegel broke with a lot of Renaissance norms. Like I said, though, Bruegel was different for his depictions of everyday life. He was also one of the first big landscape guys. Bruegel the Elder was one of a handful really trying to tackle this question of how to develop an independent, legible landscape genre, how to create works that were entirely focused on and very reflective of, in new ways, nature in their contemporary tangible world. As for what this looked like in practice, we can take the Seasons painting series in Antwerp as our example. Commissioned for the home of the wealthy merchant Nicolas Jongelik, who owned a minimum of 16 of the artist's works, though only 5 of the Seasons survive and are in different hands today. They are called Gloomy Day, Return of the Herd, Hunters in Snow, Haymaking, and The Harvesters. While the concept of seasons passing seems fairly simplistic, the Met notes that these are pretty special. Quote, though rooted in the legacy of calendar scenes, Bruegel's emphasis is not on the labors that mark each season, but on the atmosphere and transformation of the landscape itself. These panoramic compositions suggest an insightful and universal vision of the world, which distinguishes his pieces, end quote. If there's any Bruegel the Elder work, honeys, that you've likely seen, it actually probably is Hunters in the Snow. This is the one where, in the bottom left foreground, a couple of men and their dogs are approaching a village down below the crest of the hill they stand on, with skaters on a lake seen down there. Taking care not just to show the human rituals of the seasons, but to really note the landscape changes through such details, Bruegel the Elder was really doing something unique and unprecedented here. And finally, honeys, we have his work, The Dirty Bride. I've chosen to have us take a look at this one because it really shows Bruegel's eye for detail. It shows how he took what he observed from everyday life in villages and use it to make either moralizing or humorous points. A viewer is able to pick up on the sort of excitement and bustle, the rush in multiple senses of this scene by the way Bruegel depicts that sense of mood, by the way he shows the boisterousness of the activities of this county fair. Bruegel's particularly close attention on the worn costumes and on the celebrating guests' broad, emphatic gestures bring us into this narrative and help us feel like we're a part of the interpersonal action here. So, while Bruegel the Elder is comparable to Bosch in that both have really overcrowded active compositions, Bruegel clearly had different priorities and different questions he was attempting to answer. And finally, honeys, we come to our lone Southerner who is kind of a standalone figure in art history. We are talking now about El Greco. Our last little short summary by the Met of who this guy is, quote, no other great Western artist moved mentally as El Greco did from the flat symbolic world of Byzantine icons to the world-embracing humanistic vision of Renaissance painting, and then onto a predominantly conceptual kind of art, end quote. Of all of our other Renaissance guys, Greco's bio boils down to his travels and their influences the most. He was born as Dominicus Theotokopoulos in 1541 in Crete, where he received most of his initial training. In the 16th century, Crete was the center for the Byzantine artistic tradition, so he learned to emphasize abstraction and pattern rather than the more recording natural appearances format of Northern Europe. The National Gallery says that for a while in his youth, he worked as an icon painter in the Eastern Orthodox tradition. And then in 1568, he says goodbye to Crete and goes to Italy to study Western-style painting in Venice. He gains some influence during this training from Venetian artists like Titian and Tintoretto. His time in Venice and the exposure to such artists led him to embrace rich colors and a free, sketchy manner of painting that were more common to Italy. After about 2 years, though, he picks up and moves to Rome, going instead for the sort of mannerism popular there at the time. I can already pretty much hear you asking, what's mannerism? It is a more subjective view, one that's less based in nature and more on intellectual, compressed spaces. You'll often see in mannerist works weird colors, elongation, and intertwining of figures, especially in complex poses. El Greco spends some time there learning this, copying the techniques of Renaissance masters, including Michelangelo and Raphael as well, for some side practice. But Greco does not really have commercial success in Italy. He never wins any major commissions, so he moves on to Spain. Our sources have a pretty funny theory as to why that could be the case. They believe it could be because Greco had ill-advisedly criticized Michelangelo's abilities as a painter in public. The opinion likely reduced confidence in his abilities and ostracized him from the Roman art establishment because Michelangelo's prestige since his 1564 death was still very high in Rome. Whatever the reasoning, he decides to head west, and by 1577, Greco is permanently based out of Toledo, Spain. Once permanently established in Toledo, Greco produces some of his most important works, mostly by continuing to explore and also intensify the possibilities of Mannerism at this time when his Italian-based contemporaries are returning to more naturalistic styles. He decides to go against the grain and really double down on a style falling out of favor. And this has its consequences. The Frick collection notes that by his death in 1614, El Greco's aesthetic was just itself out of favor. His reputation had diminished. So if that's the case, if his reputation was basically dead by the time he was, how and why is it that we're still talking about him today? It's partially because he was just so rebellious. Say our sources, quote, El Greco rejected naturalism as a vehicle for his art, just as he rejected the idea of an art easily accessible to a large public. What he embraced was the world of a self-consciously erudite style or maniera, end quote. While many of the Renaissance artists, even some of our other Renaissance guys, were working on legibility, on making sure that even the common people who could not read were able to understand the narratives, Greco did not give a crap. He just wanted to make what he was going to make. And if there's one thing the art history canon loves, it is a guy who's not afraid to be bold. And us art historians are thinkers. We like to use our brains, and he has this sort of intellectual challenge to his works. So of course we rediscovered them and still talk about him all the time. As I said, Greco went against that paring down grain by continuing with blatant displays of artificial stuff that was an inherent part of Mannerism, even though it was already becoming criticized. Mannerism's elongated twisting forms, radical foreshortening, and unreal colors became the foundations of El Greco's art. And he, unlike anyone else, was making these effects very expressive, not just symbols of virtuosity, but as an approach to demonstrating the emotional aspects of life. As fascinating as the works themselves are, El Greco's legacy is really a legend and fascinating to look at. The National Gallery of Scotland tells us he was greatly admired by his colleagues for his efforts to dignify the painter's profession. As you may remember, in the 16th century, in Spain at least, painters were still not seen as real artists in a sense. Yet El Greco was criticized by the most intransigent counter-reformist theorists for his format, for his iconographic freedom-taking with tone and compositions. Basically, they thought him applying his style to biblical or theological scenes was a way of disrespecting said scenes. In addition to how trends move, this is part of the reason that El Greco's work fell into such obscurity after he died until its quote-unquote rediscovery in the 19th century. Even since then, Greco has been misunderstood sometimes as a prophet, a mystic of modern art, even as someone who suffered from astigmatism. Greco was also very architecturally minded. The Prado points out he favored innovatively designed multimedia artistic combinations, working not only with paint, but with altarpiece architecture and sculptures, even other canvases set into the walls or domes, in order to create his final visions, these overwhelming effects. Very few such complex formal visual systems exist in their original state today. I did see one in a cave once in Toledo, though, and I'll tell you, it was the coolest. El Greco became a major influence himself. Early 20th century painters saw him as a sort of groundbreaker when it came to rejecting mechanical imitations of reality and as the predecessor to their expressionist, subjectivist, tormented concerns. El Greco has been a big source of inspiration for and influence on others. Early 20th century painters, for example, saw him as a sort of groundbreaker when it came to rejecting mechanical imitations of reality, and saw him as a bit of a predecessor for their more expressionist, subjectivist, tormented concerns. One such artist was Picasso, who saw Greco as both the quintessential Spaniard and a painter of the spirit. Others, including members of the Blue Rider School, saw Greco as someone whose art stood as a rejection of the materialist culture of modern life. Because El Greco was so good with these details and was so interested in reflecting the Spanish Mannerist day he lived in, some of his paintings could be considered visual documents of the increasingly globalized Spanish Empire. For that, we can look to his work, The Savior, which shows not only all these influences from Spain that the Greek artist absorbed from his time there, but hints at the empire through various components. Take, for example, the red glaze on Christ's tunic, which comes from the crushed cochineal bug, itself coming from Spain's American colonies and exported to the Iberian Peninsula for world trade. Without access to this glaze from the trade, Greco would not have been able to achieve that color in the clothing. And our final work for the day to understand Greco a little better, we're going to look at his most celebrated painting, The Burial of Count Orgaz. It was commissioned by the parish priest of Santo Tomé in Toledo in 1586 to honor a long-dead benefactor. The saints Stephen and Augustine are depicted as miraculously assisting in the burial of this count, the man, while we see the count's soul being received into paradise above. The work is considered central by art experts to understanding Greco because it encapsulates the object of his art. It suggests a visionary experience, something that is not an extension of our physical world, but is rather part of our imaginative faculties, a result of the power of the brain. This, alongside the most extravagant late works of the artist, such as The Vision of St. John, have appealed especially strongly to modern tastes. All right, honeys, those are our other Renaissance guys, the guys from the north and also from Spain, who you probably have never heard of before, but who actually had a big hand in the Renaissance. I hope you're walking away today with some new knowledge and some new appreciation for the Northern Renaissance, as well as for the impact that travel has had on artists of the past. We will catch you soon, honeys. In the meantime, take care and hydrate. Talk soon. This podcast is produced, created, hosted, formerly edited, and fact-checked by master's degree holder Celia Bugnout. Chris Meinhold is responsible for our editing, mixing, and our intro and outro music. Special thanks to him for that. And as always, remember to like, subscribe, share, comment, so on all your favorite listening as well as social media channels.